The core hard reality is that there is no South African economy because it's just not sustainable if we think of it. The economic term is autarky, and that's been used a whole lot lately, in mainstream media.
How do we solve South Africa's problems of poverty and record high unemployment? Well, somebody who has been writing about these issues for over 20 years is Shawn Hagedorn. He is an independent analyst and strategy consultant based in Cape Town. Shawn Hagedorn, welcome to Solutions with David Ansara.
Thanks, David.
So Shawn, let's first start off by framing the problem. We have very high levels of unemployment in South Africa, and particularly youth unemployment. If you're a young person, you are more likely to be unemployed than in a job. And as a consequence, we have very high levels of poverty in South Africa. What is your assessment of how we got into this position as a country?
Right. Well, thanks, David. And I think it's probably the most important economic question is what to do about youth unemployment. I have a great deal to say about it, but just to summarize in a nutshell, the temptation, certainly by the ANC and by others to play along with that line, is that it's mostly about attracting investments. But that's not the primary choke point. The primary choke point is people aren't getting jobs because there's not access to customers. And that's what has to change.
I mean, obviously, attracting investment is a critical part of that mix. But do we in South Africa have a sufficiently large enough customer base to fuel demand for manufactured goods and other services?
Right. So that's exactly what the problem is that discretionary spending in South Africa has been, more or less stagnating, certainly on a per capita basis for over 10 years. And, I've been saying that for over 5, that's the track we're on. And basically what's happening is that employment is in balance, in equilibrium with spending. And to increase the capacity to spend, you'd have to grow the economy. And that really takes a long time to do that in an effective, sustainable, high growth path to where you would catch up employment-wise. And so, the vast majority of successful emerging economies figured out quite a while ago that the fast track is to focus on value-added exporting, and our policies all but prohibit that. And the focus is not on increasing value-adding exporting, and it has to be.
All right, so South Africa is a small open economy, and we have some exports of manufactured goods, and we are the beneficiary of trade arrangements like AGOA, which gives us preferential access to the USA. We have trade relationships with the EU and other major markets, but we haven't really seen the volume of exports that other emerging countries have been able to take advantage of. I'm thinking particularly in Southeast Asia and East Asia. Why are exports in South Africa so low? And what is that relationship between exports and economic growth?
Right. Okay. So to throw some numbers at it, we don't want to get bogged down in the numbers, but South Africa's economy is almost put in dollars, almost $500 billion a year. So let's just round it up to that and say that domestic consumption would be over 300 or 350 billion of the 500 billion. And you can increase commodity exports quite quickly if the price and demand goes up and Transnet is functioning and things like that. But what we really think about is that creating jobs? Is that really sustainable? You have super cycles in commodities. And so to think that we are going to resolve our horrendous youth unemployment problem through increasing commodity exports, that's not at all rational. So to do that, you have to create increased value-added exports, and the pathways are there, as you say, David. To export into the U.S. or Europe, but our policies are very, very much focused on redistribution. They're not focused at all, and in fact, they couldn't be more hostile. I mean, the local most recent wrinkle has been localization, which is going exactly the opposite direction. And it's completely unworkable. It's completely out of kilter with how the rest of the world, at least the the high growth countries, which add value, how they function. And if you really to break it down at a fundamental level, what's happening is the economy isn't focused on creating wealth. It's not close to doing that, which is pretty extraordinary. If we weren't able to pull stuff out of the ground, we'd clearly be going backwards, unlike so many other high growth economies. And then, the other thing, if you look at our economy, just so much of the focus is on redistribution that you don't even get to that halfway point of creating wealth where you would increase income by increasing productivity. But then all of that, you have to keep in mind, and then look at, do we have market access? So you reference like AGOA and things like that. So there is market access from the other side, but we're just not focused on doing that, as best summarized by the shift to localization, which is a doubling down and going in the wrong direction.
And what, in your view, is the problem with localization? Because the way the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition frames it is that we need to protect local industry from cheap imports from abroad. I'm very skeptical of that argument. What is your thesis on why localization doesn't work?
Right. Well, a lot of people get put off by economics and things like that. But, we could use the simple example of, teach someone to fish and you feed them for a day, give someone a fish and you feed them for a day, teach someone to fish and you feed them for a lifetime. Well, basically what happens in South Africa, it's like, we're all fishing in a small lake and there's not enough fish. And then government and big business, other voices say, well, let's invest in more fishing boats, but it's still focused on that small lake versus ocean-going fishing. And if you just run the numbers, switch from the focus on the fish and just out of spreadsheets, there isn't the purchasing power to employ the young people. And if I could just switch to what I think is a very helpful way of looking at things is, there's probably no better indicator predicting which economies are really going to perform in the next few decades than the portion of their young people, let's say in their 20s, which are adding value within global supply chains. Those economies are really positioned to perform. And we're the opposite. And localization just takes us further and further away from that. So we are rapidly moving in the wrong direction, which is tragic, and it has to stop.
And many of those East Asian economies started off quite low down on the value chain. They were doing very kind of simple inputs into what were ultimately quite complex finished goods, but have been able to move up that value chain. I'm thinking of a country like Taiwan, for example. So if South Africa wants to have a much more diversified, more sophisticated economy, we need to lock into some of those global value chains. How do we raise our position? How do we improve the quality of those inputs?
Right, and Taiwan is an amazing example. So, to think that we can quickly replicate Taiwan is unrealistic, but ultimately I think we can. And then here's where it's a little bit challenging, like, at a individual level, you have to have a conversation with yourself. Well, really, I'm a consultant. I mean, I sometimes have creative ideas or whatever, but I know full well that I shouldn't be going to DTI, not that they want to listen to me anyhow, but DTI shouldn't be listening to consultants saying, look, this is the pathway. Obviously, you need some of that, and there's been some of that in the past, but really what you want to do is you want to unlock. South Africa has plenty of creative entrepreneurial verve, but it's inward focused. So, I mean, I've written about this in the past as well. If we were talking about a family instead of a country, a nation, it would be like child abuse. There is no way that the vast majority of South Africa's entrepreneurs, if they're inward focused, that they can succeed. So they can gather more fish than the guys on the other boats, but then the other guys are going to suffer. We're just not going to proceed. So, there has to be that leap of faith, but so many other countries have done it, and the world keeps changing, which presents opportunities. And by the way, Asian, their labor costs keep going up. I mean, Taiwan's labor costs are extremely high, and so they're moving up sort of the value chain. I mean, they're by far the best in the world at silicon chips, and no one can touch them. I mean, it's pretty bizarre. And then that came from nowhere. And so, and no one really saw that coming when they started making those moves in the early 80s. And so we don't really need to predict, but we need to have enough faith in say are 20-year-olds. And the other thing to keep in mind, if you switch from a South African perspective to a global perspective, there's not enough young people in the world. There's not an overabundance of young people. So really the stage is set, but then we have to have the courage to go out and compete, on the global stage. And the efficient way to do that is not like, Discovery and Investec and Nando's. They're great companies, very impressive what they've done, but they don't create jobs, in any meaningful extent back in South Africa when they succeed overseas. It's much, much more effective if you just have a whole lot of smaller companies, probably for the most part, integrating within global supply chains. Then really the sky's the limit.
One of the other refrains that we often hear, Shawn, is that of beneficiation. And you mentioned high volumes of commodities exports. And unfortunately, one of the side effects of this war in Ukraine is that commodity prices have gone up because of constraints on supply, which is benefiting South Africa. And we saw in the recent budget speech that our revenues have ticked up. The fiscal deficit has narrowed somewhat, still quite high. But what is this problem with this idea of beneficiation? Because it sounds very nice. Oh, we shouldn't just be pulling raw materials out of the ground. We should be making our own products. What are some of the shortcomings of this approach?
So beneficiation is a term we hear a lot, and it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. I mean, it's not just me saying that. I can certainly reference top economic professors from top universities who don't take the term seriously at all. Not that it's meaningful in the sense that, sure, if you pull something out of the ground and you can do something with it, you should, if you can do that competitively. But if you run the numbers, I mean, and I ran some numbers around beneficiation, I think the year was like 98 or 99. And if you look at the cost of how much to ship sort of the basic materials to build a car from South Africa to China versus the cost of shipping the car from China to South Africa, it's like 100 times more expensive to ship the car. You really want to build the cars, where the customers are. And the fact, it's very inexpensive, really, even with today's high energy prices, it's very inexpensive to ship raw materials. Finished goods are much more expensive. So beneficiation, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny in the least. The opposite, sort of the opposite concept, which you never hear of in South Africa's lexicon, talking about economics, is diffusion. And that's what happens in global supply chains. Once you're tapped into a global supply chain, if you're a young worker, even at a pretty base level, you're just more exposed to how the global economy is moving and what the needs are and what skills you want to develop. And that's a completely different mindset. And it's not just from a knowledge perspective diffusion, but the even more powerful effect is you're taking labor from a low-cost country, and then you're selling goods and or services. You're adding value to goods or services to highly affluent customers. And then that has a massive sort of multiplier leveraging effect, because if they're more affluent customers, you can have higher margins. So when you look to see what happens within spreadsheets, it's pretty magical versus the concept that you're going to sell commodities, let's say agricultural commodities to low-income countries. It's the rate at which an economy can advance with that approach is very, very slow, versus if young people particularly are adding value to goods and services in global supply chains, you get those Taiwan effects where you can really sustain very high rates of growth. And a lot of it is because the workers are developing really valuable skills.
Your argument is that maybe some of these industrial policy interventions by the state to try and direct economic activity are misplaced. But I think there's also a separate conversation that we need to have around the regulation of the labor market itself. And I think that that's quite important. We have a very highly restricted labor regulatory framework, the National Minimum Wage Act, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the Labor Relations Act. All of these serve to tighten up the labor market. They benefit existing workers at the expense of the unemployed. So what can be done to try and unlock the labor market and liberalize it some more?
So the labor regulations absolutely have to change. I mean, it's just criminal that people are denied employment opportunities, right from the get-go. And really, we're going down a path where what should be our most valuable asset, which is young people, they're going to be sidelined really, for their entire lives. And it's important to keep in mind, someone who's 20 has never had a job, and even if they're poorly educated, that's sad. We need to get them jobs. But by the time they're in their 30s, it really starts to change a lot. You can take a poorly educated 20-year-old person, and within a supportive work environment, they can develop a lot. Okay, really a great deal. Sky's the limit. The person's individual limitations are the limit, not the policies around them. So from where we are now, where we're making no progress, I would say to focus on the path of least resistance. And I would strongly argue that there should really be special dispensations, however you want to say it, really protection from all of the anti-competitive, anti-growth labor and BEE and even tax regulations for any sort of young people who are adding value to goods and services, and to shift into that sort of mindset, it doesn't really cost anybody, because we're just missing out on these opportunities. Companies aren't coming from Asia to diversify to produce goods and services or add value to goods and services in South Africa, destined to Europe or North America. There's none of that going on because South Africa just is not an attractive export destination for adding value to goods and services. And that's what has to change. Otherwise, we have no chance of meaningfully reducing the youth unemployment. And then after a few years, you just create a massive hole in the economy. And I don't think people begin to appreciate how difficult that is to achieve. And we're very close to that. I mean, just another few years. And the damage done is really just horrific. And it'll take a very long time to correct, assuming that, you could even turn policies on its head.
Yes, and as Ricardo Hausmann, the Harvard economist, once wrote, that the skills that you use on the job are the skills that you actually learn on the job itself. So it's through working that you acquire the skills that we need. And I think it's quite popular for people to point to the importance of education. And obviously education is really critical, but that's a long-term play. That's going to take many, many years to fix the problems in education. And also there are many millions of people who've already gone through the education system who are now seeking work and need to develop skills that are competitive. So I think this is a really good way of generating new skills in the labor market.
Absolutely. And I'm a huge fan of Ricardo Hausmann, and he makes a lot of brilliant points. But I think I'd put that at the top, at least in terms of relevance for South Africa. I mean, I'm repeating myself a little bit, but you take each year, let's say there's a million South Africans who become 20 years old. There's 100,000 of them, I would say, whose education, could have been better. But, if people were entrepreneurial about saying, well, hang on, this person has this skill, this person has that skill. And people wondering, well, what am I talking about? Sort of a generation ago, suddenly call centers became a big thing. And South Africa participated a little bit, but not a lot. And really, that's just an example. But then, like with 3D printing, the capacity to personalize products and services, across the globe, as the economy becomes more and more service-oriented, becomes much more digital, the distance factors fall away. But really, the component you need to bring two things together to employ these people is you need to have some policy leeway, some carve-outs to allow them to enter the global market, and then you need to have that entrepreneurial verve. And that's not happening. We've got a wall between those two things, and it prevents people from coming and investing in South Africa and mobilizing capital to employ people to integrate within global supply chains, which would create. It's really the only way to rapidly increase employment I don't see how the economy can avoid really dire prospects without those sort of special dispensations.
Right, Shawn. Well, one of the constraints on our ability to export is, first of all, our distance to market. So if you consider, for example, economies like Mexico, Turkey, they have very close proximity to major markets like the United States and Europe, respectively. South Africa, we're all the way down here on the bottom tip of Africa. And then another constraint is also our ability to get goods to the ports and out onto the sea. So how do we overcome those two problems of distance to market and infrastructure decay?
I do think we need to distinguish between performance, policies versus practices. So there's the policies which just make South Africa, uninvestable for export-oriented activities, value-adding export activities. So, and then there's like the commodity exporting, where obviously, that's the opposite of a digital economy, and that's where you really need to move in bulk. And so obviously we need to do that better, but people should be aware that's not going to create a lot of jobs. And I mean, this is well worth thinking about. Suddenly we sorted all those problems out, and South Africa's GDP was taking off. And kind of like the 5 years you had from about 2002 to 2007, like 5% average annual GDP growth. Well, that helped with creating employment, but we never really did the transformation, and that was never really going to lead to employing the vast majority of school leavers, and that really is the primary success determinant, because we have to transform from a resource-based economy, and really to get our heads around this, all we need to see is what's happened to Russia now. Whether the Europeans and others stop buying the oil and gas, their economy, if you're a 20-year-old Russian with aspirations, maybe on an individual basis, there's still, you can still do well. But as a group, we can be really confident, unless something dramatically happens, that in Russia, change of leadership, and Russia really integrates back into the global economy like it never really has. The 20-year-olds, for the most part, their life prospects will be vastly dimmer than they need to be. And South Africa's situation is very, very similar. But we very much brought it upon ourselves at the policy level, just saying, look, we're going to be very inward looking. And again, it goes back to that thing. We're just going to fish in this one lake, and we're not going to go out to sea. And that was never going to work. That was always going to bring us to where we are now. And that's what has to change.
So another thing that needs to change, Shawn, is the way in which we conceptualize policy in the context of political realignment. So it seems subsequent to the 2021 local government elections that there is a sea change happening. This was the first time that the ANC went below 50%. They got 46% on aggregate across the various municipalities. So, this is going to play out in some quite dramatic ways in 2024 in the next national and provincial elections. How do you see this policy discussion evolving over that time period? Because we're under 800 days away from that election, and I think there's some serious discussions that need to be had about the policy framework in the country.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking that, David, because that's a really important piece. What I'm saying is it's completely unrealistic to think, okay, there's going to be a coalition government. I've been writing about this for a long time. I hope hopefully there'll be a coalition government in 2024 at the national level that has vastly different ideas. But to think that the people and the parties are going to cohere about some high growth model to take South Africa in a much more positive direction, within the weeks and months after the election, that's profoundly unlikely. It's not plausible unless we really change the national dialogue now to get much more realistic. And then if I can just frame it this way, So what holds South Africa back is it's very difficult to at the same time see how you can combine sort of social justice objectives, economic development objectives, commercial economic development, commercial economics, and have all of that in mind, how they align, and then how the world keeps changing. But that's what needs to happen. And the good news is, if people do the work properly and without, politically shaped limitations, all these things do align. That's the very good news. We're impeding ourselves. I mean, an example I use is like the people in Parliament. They should be looking towards the harbor. Instead, they look at the mountain, and all they see is impediments. We must look at what and how there are global opportunities.
Right. And Shawn, I mean, it seems also that there needs to be a big political fight over these two issues that we've discussed: industrial policy and labor market regulation. So if there is this coalition that's beginning to coalesce, how would they go about engaging in this fight? Because there's some pretty deeply embedded interests around both of these considerations. So how do you start to make those political trade-offs and make that argument more forcefully?
Events that have been unfolding over the last 3 or 4 weeks. So there's been a lot of economic lessons. The reality is, so the West are basically the country that's been wealthy for a long time, so they have a lot of purchasing power. That's what's so different than South Africa. That's why we have so much unemployment, because we don't have enough purchasing power. And not only that, their economies are very focused, for the most part, on creating wealth. Okay, South Africa's not close. We don't even focus on productivity. So there's some really strong lessons there. And so basically what people want to do when they look at things like social justice, economic development, and big companies and things like that, they sort of want to wag their finger and use value judgments. And because it takes quite a bit of work to get your head comfortably around how these topics align. But stop making those value judgments, and be open-minded to where, hang on, these are what the successful countries have done. We're very isolated here. We're a long way from a top three or four economies in the world, or the real clusters of high growth. So we're not influenced by having neighbors who also have had a lot of historical grievances, and they have ethnic strife and things like that. But they realize that, hang on, the way forward is you integrate within the global economy, and everyone's better off. So we're lacking that. But if we did look at the news and kind of figure out the lessons that are being taught, it's pretty obvious that if Russia has new leadership, they can be very much accepted into the West, and they can suddenly, their growth trajectory is much steeper. I mean, it's really radical. And the same for South Africa.
Right, Shawn. Well, I mean, one of the pet peeves that I have about the labor market in South Africa is the extension of collective bargaining agreements to non-parties. And I think this is very emblematic of the kind of corporatist compact that exists in South Africa at the moment, because what essentially happens is a major employer and a major trade union, for example, in the metal sector, they'll get together and negotiate an agreed wage for the entire sector. So even organizations that are not party to those negotiations have to then apply those wages. It seems also there's this increase in inflation, a lot of pressures on people's pockets. So there, it seems to me, is going to be a big political fight emerging, that if we need to break the stranglehold that unions and big embedded businesses have on the labor market, we're going to need to challenge that problem. So how do we go about doing that?
Right. Well, there's a long list of issues like that. And my answer is it doesn't work. I mean, look, you can't not respond. You have to make the case. I've been doing that. So that was fortunate, has some wonderful think tanks. And that hasn't had a whole lot of effect. So what I'm saying is that we need to go and show where there is a way forward, and that's why I make the case for carve-outs from these anti-growth regulations, and then when people see what is possible, and then so that's your pet peeve, the bit about projecting onto non-participants the results of collective bargaining by other parties. And I agree with you 1,000%. But my pet peeve, which I think goes even deeper, is so now we're at a point where there's massive prolonged youth unemployment. And at the same time, we're debating, subsistence payments to, the vast majority of young people are healthy and employable and can't get jobs. And and this is not really my point, is, the ANC is very good about how they frame issues, and we go along with their framing, I think, way too much. They're framing that as a moral issue of subsistence payments versus fiscal responsibility, as if they're taking the high road, and they're not looking at really across the board sweeping policy shifts, which is what we have to get to. If we don't get there, it doesn't work. And so my response, personally, although I agree with you, on that issue, is that taking these issues on bit by bit is important, but it's not going to get you there. You have to show that there's something that will work. There is a better way. And then when coalitions come together, hopefully in 2024, that they see, hang on, we have a track record of this working. And by the way, even the ANC, the ANC likes pilot projects. They like SEZs, but they think in geographic terms. So it's helpful to work with others using solutions that they're at least somewhat comfortable with, and then you mold it into something that moves in the direction that we have to move into.
Yeah, and I think the mistake that many people make, and this is something I've observed throughout my several years working at the Center for Risk Analysis, is that they assume that policy is kind of like a technocratic exercise, that it's just around optimizing the right set of laws and regulations. But they perhaps don't always appreciate the role that ideology plays in informing the policy in the first place. And policy is downstream from the ideological convictions and predispositions of the government of the day. Do you think that ideology is an underrated characteristic of some of these policy discussions?
Right. Well, you started to smile there a little bit, and I smile a bit as well. I mean, I'm torn. I think it's, to be a bit crude, it's like the communists versus the thugs, who very aggressively just seek to get rich with, no remorse for the effects. But, the evidence is there. The ideology is a big, it runs very, very deep. But I still come out that, you're not going to win the ideological arguments if you still haven't won them, despite all the evidence to the contrary. So without showing what is possible, and things are so bad now in terms of the trajectory that we're on. And, so I would rather focus on young people and their aspirations. And, so I should throw one other thing into this. Sometimes people think that, well, hang on, the people who are well off, they can just give more to the people who have almost nothing, subsistence. That it completely ignores the dignity thing. People who want to be self-sufficient for themselves, their partners, their children, if the government today, it isn't allowing them to do that, that's a remarkable failure. Poverty has plummeted in the last 30 years. Yeah, it's really only governments that rely on extraction based commodity exporting, where you get thug types who are indifferent to the masses, and then they grab hold of ideology because it's hell of a convenient, and it seems to give them a shield. I'm not buying the ideology, but I don't know, what people really think. And I'm sure there's some people who really are full-on Marxists, but that's only a portion of it, as I see it.
And I think the point that you made earlier, Shawn, about the moral argument, I think that's just as important as the technical argument. So you can point to economic models, and you can look at other countries that have successfully emerged out of poverty, and you can compare policies. But you also need to be able to make the moral case, as you have done, to say it is unconscionable that we have millions of people who are unemployed, who are at the margins of our society. We need to bring them in. Also winning that debate around the profit motive. I think that that's really important. That's seen as something kind of dirty. I see all on my LinkedIn feed, many companies proudly proclaiming their corporate social investments, supporting charities and so on, all of which are noble causes. But very seldom do I see companies championing the profits that they've made, the value that they've created in terms of good products and services, the jobs that they've created. I think that is equally, if not more, important. So I think we need to kind of win that moral argument as well.
Right. So I'd very much like to underline that. So people feel good. We're coming together, national unity. That's feel good stuff, which is important. Well. So a lot of people do that every day because they work in big companies. The reality is there's a lot of things which big companies are just much better at. And big companies tend to pay better. So we romanticize entrepreneurs. I mean, I love entrepreneurs. But we should be cognizant of the fact that we live in a world with nearly 8 billion people. Most all of them are living pretty well. Less than 10% are seriously poor. And it would be pretty darn difficult to do that without a whole lot of people coming together within large corporations. So the idea that we're so isolated from the rest of the world that we can create our own version of morality, and we wave our fingers at people we don't like, and we want to criticize big companies just for the sake of their being big. Well, they get a whole lot done that we need to get done.
Right, Shawn. Well, a recurring theme in this podcast is that of decentralization. And I think that's very important for breaking the monopolies that often the state or entrenched business interests have on an economy. How would you apply this theme of decentralization to South Africa's economy? How can we devolve power down and out and to better unlock the value that exists at the local level in South Africa?
Well, I think the core hard reality is that there is no South African economy because it's just not sustainable if we think of it. The economic term is autarky, and that's been used a whole lot lately. In mainstream media, talking about, because that's where Russia's going. But we've chosen to go. It just means that you're independent. And by the way, South Africa, the Russians have the most resources in the world, and then the U.S. and South Africa. They're the top three. And depending on how you measure it, but generally that's true. So you would think those would be the three countries that could operate independently of the rest of the world, which is what autarky speaks to. The reality is that it's just not an option, and there are very clear reasons why. And it's a bit of a free lunch thing. And sorry because it's a bit wide, but there are a few free lunches. Specialization in labor adds so much productivity. It's like a free lunch. And the same thing with the theory of competitive advantage, different nations and globalization. And so to think of South Africa as being an independent economy is basically fatal. We will go, I don't know how low we'll go, but it'll be very low. And then we'll have to start over again and seeing South Africa as part of the global economy. And then the way to be part of the global economy, you really have to look at your young people. And again, there's not enough young people in the world. Is the way the world is today. I mean, China's, for instance, their labor force is contracting, but and there's a whole lot of them are. Certainly not China, but it's pretty extreme that they have that situation there. So we're really just restricting ourselves if we think of South Africa as an independent economy. That goes back to my like thing.
Right. And Shawn, these are very important proposals, but many people watching this might not necessarily have the power to act on these. But how would you suggest that people go about incorporating some of your recommendations today into the way in which they do business or the way in which they operate in South Africa?
We can all have a voice in reshaping the national dialogue. I mean, I learned so much from reading comments that people write about news articles. I mean, I just treasure that. So there's the national dialogue, and then there's also so big companies can look to young, it doesn't have to be young, but entrepreneurial companies in terms of working with them to break into global markets. That's incredibly important. And I think, just generally, I say this, it doesn't always go over so well, but I say this to young entrepreneurs who, I respect. Look, these really are the future of South Africa. A lot of these people, they're very focused on the local market, the inland lake. And that really needs to change. I mean, and if you're someone who supports entrepreneurs, whether you're a mentor or an investor, really push them to find international niches, and many of them will. And if they don't, I would be much less supportive, because it's not helpful. It'd be much better to shift whatever support we can bring to bear on those entrepreneurs who are outward focused.
Shawn Hagedorn, thank you very much for sharing your solutions with us.
Thank you, David.
If you enjoyed this content and you're watching on YouTube, please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, please do subscribe there as well. Do also share this episode with friends or family who might find it interesting. My name is David Ansara. This is the Solutions Podcast. Until next time, take care.